What is up, everybody? Today we're heading south for some pretty devastating, but also equally important news out of Australia. But before we get to that, welcome to Biodiversity Lab, where we discuss all things wildlife and conservation. This is a new channel, and I'm excited to bring you guys all sorts of wildlife news, conservation deep dives, species accounts, and more. My name is Chris Scanlon. I'm a professional wildlife biologist with degrees in biology and sustainability. And if you're into this kind of stuff as much as I am and want to see more of it, please consider liking and subscribing to help the channel grow. Okay, now with that out of the way, to Australia we go, where a severe heat wave across southeastern Australia has killed thousands of flying foxes, triggering one of the largest mass mortality events for these animals since the 2019-20 Black Summer fires, and renewing concern about the vulnerability of multiple bat species to extreme heat. Yeah, this is definitely on the heavy side, but it's still important and it still deserves to be told, so I hope you'll stick with me. Temperatures exceeded 42 to 43 degrees Celsius or 107 to 109 degrees Fahrenheit across parts of South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales, overwhelming the bat's ability to regulate body temperature. Wildlife agencies and volunteer responders reported widespread deaths across multiple flying fox camps, including major urban colonies in Melbourne, Adelaide, and Sydney. So when I first saw the headline, I immediately wanted to know, what species are we talking about here, and what are their conservation statuses? While Australia is home to 4 mainland species of flying foxes, the die-off primarily affected southeastern Australia's grey-headed flying foxes, a species already classified as vulnerable under Australia's Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act and listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. Flying foxes are large, fruit and nectar feeding bats in the genus Chiroptis. Australia's flying foxes also include black flying foxes, which are not listed nationally and least concern according to the IUCN. They're found in northern and eastern Australia. Spectacled flying foxes, found in far north Queensland, which are listed as endangered at both federal and global levels. And little red flying foxes, which are least concerned and widespread across inland and northern Australia. The January 2026 die-off occurred primarily within the range of the gray-headed flying fox, making its conservation implications particularly acute. Historically, flying foxes were among the most abundant large mammals in eastern Australia. Gray-headed flying foxes were estimated to number well over 1 million individuals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, before extensive forest clearing, persecution, and orchard culling drove steep declines. By the 1990s, monitoring suggested the gray-headed flying fox population had fallen by approximately 35% within just one decade, prompting its listing as a threatened species. More recent national monitoring between 2012 and 2022 indicates the population stabilized at roughly 600,000 individuals. While this stability has been interpreted as a tentative conservation success, researchers caution that it masks extreme vulnerability to sudden mortality events. Females give birth to only 1 pup per year, meaning population recovery depends heavily on adult female survival. A single large die-off can erase years of demographic gain, and we'll get to why females are particularly vulnerable to heat stress here in a few minutes. So while recent times have not been kind to the gray-headed flying fox, the situation is even more precarious for the spectacled flying fox, which declined by approximately 75% between 2004 and 2017, falling from an estimated 200,000 plus individuals to around 50,000 or fewer. That's just insane. In 2018, a single heat wave in far north Queensland killed roughly 23,000 spectacled flying foxes, wiping out a third of the entire population of the species over the course of just a few days. Luckily, the current heat wave in Australia is not quite so bad, but still, it has affected multiple flying fox camps. And so in Victoria, wildlife responders reported thousands of dead bats at major colonies, including in Brimbank Park and Yarra Bend Park in Melbourne, as well as hundreds more at regional camps such as Tatura. In South Australia, temperatures exceeded 43 degrees Celsius, triggering the state's first documented large-scale flying fox mortality event, with approximately 1,000 to 2,000 deaths recorded around Adelaide. In New South Wales, particularly around Sydney and western suburbs, hundreds to around 1,000 bats were reported dead across multiple camps. And if you don't want to hear how responders describe the scenes, you can skip ahead to the timestamp on the screen to jump to the next section where we discuss flying fox adaptations to heat and why they're vulnerable to climate change. Okay, so responders described bats collapsing from branches, disoriented individuals crawling on the ground, and large numbers of orphaned pups clinging to deceased mothers. Wildlife rescue organizations mobilized emergency triage operations, rescuing some heat-stressed bats and collecting surviving pups for hand rearing. Carers emphasized, however, that once temperatures cross lethal thresholds, interventions can only save a small fraction of affected animals. And at this point, you might be thinking, aren't flying foxes native to Australia, so shouldn't they be able to handle the heat? And the truth is that, yes, they are native, and they are adapted to warm climates, but they already live close to their upper thermal limits, and extreme heat, which is becoming more and more common, can push them beyond that upper limit. Their vulnerability lies in how they dissipate heat and in how rapidly those strategies fail once air temperatures approach their body temperature. Flying foxes don't sweat. Instead, they rely on behavioral and evaporative cooling, like wing fanning to move air across blood-rich wing membranes, panting, and licking their wrists, chests, and wings so saliva can evaporate and carry heat away from their bodies. Now, normally, these strategies work just fine in moderately hot conditions, but they collapse and actually work against them when temperatures rise into the low 40s Celsius or 104 plus Fahrenheit. At roughly 40 to 42 degrees Celsius, the physics just turn against them. When surrounding air is nearly as hot as the bat's body, airflow no longer provides any cooling. Evaporation becomes the primary cooling mechanism, and evaporation requires water. As heat persists, bats can dehydrate rapidly while attempting to cool themselves. Dehydration then reduces evaporative capacity, creating a positive feedback loop where less water leads to less cooling, higher body temperature, and accelerated heat stress. Once core temperatures rise high enough, bats can suffer heat stroke and organ failure within just a few hours. And conditions within camps further amplify risks. Mortality often concentrates in the hottest microsites like exposed trees with sparse canopy cover, sun-baked riverbanks, and urban environments affected by heat island effects. Dense roosting can reduce airflow while humidity from the dense roost limits evaporation. In these conditions, local temperatures experienced by bats may be substantially higher than regional weather readings. Pups and lactating females are disproportionately affected too. Pups have underdeveloped thermoregulation and depend on their mothers to cool them. Lactating females carry additional energetic and thermal burdens from the pups, and in extreme heat, may drop pups or succumb alongside them. Because flying foxes reproduce slowly, this loss of both adults and offspring carries outsized consequences for population recovery. As a result, a single severe heat wave can effectively eliminate an entire cohort of newborns and a disproportionate number of breeding females, temporarily skewing surviving populations toward older males and non-breeding individuals, and leaving the species far less resilient than raw population numbers alone would suggest. Now, at this point, you might be thinking that this sounds awful, and you might be wondering what people are doing about it. And luckily, there is a little bit of good news. Um, but also, in my research for this video, I've come to understand that flying foxes occupy an uneasy place in Australia's urban landscape. And now, to preface this, I'm not Australian, obviously. I've never been to Australia, though I would love to go visit at some point. Um, so I don't want to speak with too much authority on what Australians as a whole do or do not think about flying foxes. Honestly, I don't really know. But this is what my research has led me to believe is the general consensus. And please, if you're Australian and watching this, let me know in the comments if this is true or not. Um, so, Flying foxes occupy an uneasy place in Australia's urban landscape. As habitat loss pushes colonies into towns and cities, residents often describe them as noisy, smelly, and messy, and in some communities, they are viewed primarily as a public nuisance rather than as wildlife of conservation concern. And during heat events, the sight of dead or distressed bats in public places can further harden negative perceptions. Some concerns seem to be rooted in inconvenience rather than evidence. Public health authorities consistently report that the risk flying foxes pose to the general public is extremely low, provided people do not handle the bats. Diseases commonly cited in public discourse are either exceedingly rare or require direct contact to transmit them, and casual exposure to bats, droppings, or urine does not pose any meaningful health threat. And I think at this point, it's worth pausing here to say that the main virus of concern when it comes to flying foxes is Australian bat lyssavirus, which is extremely rare, found in less than 1% of bats, and only transmissible through bites or deep scratches. Bats will leave you alone, so if you leave them alone, you really don't have anything to worry about. Hendra virus is another bat-associated virus, but humans can't get Hendra virus from bats. You can only get Hendra virus from infected horses. So again, not really anything to worry about with bats there. And you can't get viruses from bat feces or urine. And lastly on this topic, Australian bats do not carry Ebola and played no role in COVID-19. Okay, another root cause of negative sentiment towards flying foxes is that their camps are smelly and loud. These impacts typically are seasonal and localized and can be reduced through buffer vegetation management rather than removal of the colony as a whole. And what's often lost in these discussions is the ecological role flying foxes play, a role that is both unusual and irreplaceable among Australian mammals. Flying foxes are among the continent's most effective long-distance pollinators and seed dispersers. And unlike birds or insects that typically move pollen only short distances, flying foxes routinely travel tens of kilometers in a single night, carrying pollen and seeds between isolated forest fragments. This long-range movement helps maintain genetic connectivity between distant plant populations that would otherwise become inbred or locally extinct. Their ecological influence is especially pronounced in eucalyptus woodlands and rainforest systems. Many native trees flower at night and rely heavily on flying foxes for pollination. In rainforests, flying foxes disperse the seeds of large fruited species that small animals simply cannot move, aiding forest regeneration after disturbance and supporting the structure of mature forests. By linking fragmented habitats, flying foxes also contribute indirectly to carbon storage and landscape resilience, roles that are increasingly important under a changing climate. Because of this combination of abundance, mobility, and ecological impact, flying foxes are widely regarded as keystone species, animals whose loss would trigger cascading effects throughout ecosystems. The removal of a large number of flying foxes does not simply reduce bat numbers. It weakens the reproductive capacity of forests and slows the recovery of ecosystems already stressed by drought, fire, and land clearing. In this context, the mass deaths observed during extreme heat waves are not just a wildlife welfare issue or a local nuisance problem. They represent a broader ecological signal, the loss of a group of species that humbly perform essential ecosystem functions at the continental scale. So you might be wondering if there's anything we can do to prevent future losses of flying foxes. The January 2026 die-off has intensified calls for proactive heatwave planning. While addressing climate change remains the long-term imperative, researchers and wildlife managers emphasize that local interventions can significantly reduce mortality when deployed in advance of extreme heat. One of the clearest demonstrations comes from Victoria, where a tree-mounted sprinkler system was trialed at a flying fox camp in Bendigo during a comparable heat event in January 2021. The system cooled the roost microclimate and resulted in 0 recorded bat deaths, compared to significant mortality during a similar heat wave at the same site the previous year when no sprinklers were in place. The trial has since been cited as proof of concept for scalable heat mitigation infrastructure. Effective cooling systems are designed to lower ambient temperatures within the roost, not to directly hose the bats. Fine mist or overhead sprinkling creates a localized rain effect that supports evaporative cooling without forcing bats to expend additional energy. Other measures include forecast-based early warning protocols, pre-positioning misting or sprinkler equipment, protecting and enhancing shade-providing canopy trees, and ensuring access to nearby water sources. Wildlife agencies also stress that camp disturbance or dispersal during extreme heat can worsen outcomes, forcing bats to fly in lethal conditions or separating mothers from pups. Hands-on rescue and triage remain essential for saving individual bats, particularly pups, but cannot address mortality at the scale of entire colonies. Public health authorities continue to advise that members of the public should not handle bats and that injured animals should be reported to trained, vaccinated wildlife carers. So now, how do we contextualize this for the present day? These heat-related flying fox die-offs are a warning sign and are now occurring far too frequently to be thought of as isolated events. In the past, they were rare. Over the past decade, they've become increasingly frequent, with tens of thousands of bats dying during extreme heat events in 2014, 2018-19, 2019-20, and now again in 2026. Scientists warn that climate change is driving hotter, longer, and more frequent heat waves, pushing flying foxes beyond limits they have little capacity to adapt to on ecological timescales. As one conservation biologist involved in the response noted, mass bat die-offs are not just tragic wildlife events, they're early indicators of ecosystems under acute climate stress. As Australia braces for more extreme summers, the question is no longer whether such events will recur, but whether people will act quickly enough to save some of the continent's most ecologically important mammals. All right, that was a heavy one. If you're still here, thank you very much for sticking with it. Stories like this are not always easy to tell or sit through, I'm sure, but that doesn't mean they're any less important or worth telling. If you want a palate cleanser, I've got a much happier story right here about some newborn wild gorilla twins. You can click on that. I put a lot of effort and care into trying to tell these stories accurately and responsibly. If you appreciate learning about that kind of stuff, please consider subscribing. I'd love to hear from you in the comments too. What do you think about the plight of Australia's flying foxes? And are there any wildlife stories from your part of the world that you think deserve attention? Let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.